Hello everyone, welcome to episode 12 of Lit Happens Season 2. Today we're focusing on essay question breakdowns without the panic. So today's going to be a bit of a solo podcast episode from yours truly, getting into the thick of the term now. Adriel and I have had to divide and conquer a little bit, so you will hear some future episodes where he is taking on some solos as well, but we just want to make sure that we have something in your ears every week to let you know that we are there. We thought that today's little episode could focus on how we might break down an essay question as teachers and how we might actually scaffold and support students to do the same. So just before we get in today, what we wanted to do when we're looking at these essay questions breakdown is, we all know that scenario of students read the question and suddenly every quote they've memorized, every idea they've had, everything they've pre-prepared kind of disappears and goes out the window. Today, I'm hoping to be able to show those students and give you guys some extra pointers on exactly how to break down a question so that you know what you're going to write before you even put that pen down on that paper. It is really tricky when you get that question, particularly in exam conditions, but hopefully with these strategies that you can practice every term, practice in the pre-assessment period, and then hopefully be able to get as close to perfection of this strategy as possible into the actual official trial and HSC exams, which are going to be coming around the corner. Things move really quickly in the school term. And so I think let's get started then. So the first thing we might start talking about then with students is how we actually go about breaking down the essay question. Now, the essay question breakdown is the first non-negotiable rule, right? I always say to my students, there's a few things to be done here before you even think about putting pen to paper. This often occurs during the reading time as well of exam conditions. So if students are wondering where this occurs, you often have a handful of time before you can actually begin physically writing for your exam. And this is where you need to get very adept at being able to interpret a question on the spot and mentally plan your approach before you can even get into your writing time. So first non-negotiable move is breaking down the question. And what I often ask students to consider is what type of question are we dealing with here? Right, so there's, I think, a few different categories here. So what I explain to my students in class as well. When you see a question, sometimes it's quite generic in a sense that it's just rubric specific. So it's going to feature the key terms of the general rubric that you're all studying for that particular module and essay text in question. And therefore, because it's very rubric specific, it's not likely to ask you a very specific thing relevant to your own text or prescribed text. It's going to phrase a question in a way that all of the prescribed texts are going to be able to access and engage. So we might have a rubric specific question. Let's say we're doing the HSC course, the common module, text and human experiences. So the question might look at something to do with human experience, or to do with emotions and human qualities, because that is directly guided from the rubric. The other type of question that students might get given in an exam condition is it might be a more idea-specific question. So these are your types of questions that might start off with the rubric, but then also specify certain issues or ideas or themes, if you will. So it might say something like, the complexity of the human experience when examining the notion of power or love or isolation. So it's important for students to realize, there's something deeper that has to be done here. Not only are you engaging with that rubric part of the question, but now you've got an extra layer here where it wants you to zone in on a particular idea or issue. Obviously, as we go along in the episode, we'll talk about different ways to do that and different approaches. But that would be, I guess, my second type of category. And then I'll also consider a third/fourth category. So the next type of question is a very text-specific one. So in this text-specific category of question, you would have specific references to your prescribed text that might include certain characters, that might include form. Form is a really big one when it comes to the type of question that students get, and it really guides the way they've got to look at that question, and other things including specific ideas or issues that are deliberate within their own prescribed text, but not necessarily seen in some of the other prescribed texts. So I think it's always important, I say to my students, you do need to be able to examine the difference, because when you can tell what the type of question is, it's actually giving you that insight into how big or narrow your thinking needs to be to appropriately engage with that question, right? So as students, you would probably note, you always have these questions where they're either broad or they happen to be asking something that you've already prepared for and you can very comfortably hit the nail of the head. But sometimes you do get questions that offer a little bit more specificity. And if you want to, get that band 6, that high band 5, you actually have to answer the particulars of the question with that nuance. And if you can't determine what that particular and nuance is in terms of what text type is asking you, you're going to come across a little bit of difficulty there. So that's something that I know that I always suggest to my students. What is it? What are we looking for? What is involved? Then the next step, that many of us teachers would guide students with is how they identify the key parts of the question. So when I say to my students, we want to underline the key terms, yes, that is an appropriate thing, but I also say to them, well, you need to isolate what is the verb of that task. Is it asking you to critically analyze? Is it asking you evaluate? Is it saying to what extent? Because what this verb is, even though there's connections between them, what that verb is actually going to give you that little bit more guidance into the voice that you need to be taking when you're engaging with that question. Okay, and then I would say is, okay, we've got the verb. What are some key terms or qualifiers here? So you might find that some of the key terms are meta language that's specific to your rubric, maybe meta language that's specific to your text. Sometimes they're qualifiers like significant, complex. You might even see words like ultimately. And so it's really important, I think, for students to consider. I say to them, why are all of these words important? They're all important. They're all working together. They're all playing a role. What is the connection in the relationship? Because if you can't kind of get that, you're going to miss a core part of the question that's then going to leave your response a little bit lacking. And then the third part in terms of the key terms of the question is obviously noting if there are any specific ideas or concepts for reference there. This might be some actual content focus within your prescribed text, a key issue that is explored, or a key conceptual matter that's represented within your text type. So it's really important to be aware that the question could be as broad as just rubric based to as specific, where it could include the rubric and form, features, characterization, and ideas, concepts, thematic concerns. The more prepared you are for those nuances, the less likely a student is going to get thrown by a question that is given to them. So I guess what we want to say is, like, let's say we had this question: to what extent does the text explore the complexity of human experiences? We know we've got a to what extent question. We know that this is a very rubric-based question, explore the complexity of human experience, but we know that the terms, the signifiers of explore and complexity are really important here. So what we might do to break that down verbally, the verb, to what extent, you need to argue your position here. You might be entirely in agreement, or you might actually say yes and, or yes or yes but. There's students have a bit more power and control here in terms of their voice when they can determine how exactly they're going to argue this position. Obviously most students will just say, successfully, effectively, or powerfully, but depends on the question, because students might have a slightly more nuanced approach, and therefore it might not be as conventional as just successfully, effectively. And that's all dependent on the student as well and how they're engaging. Then you'd look at, for that question, those key ideas. So obviously the complexity of human experience is the big idea. So that is quite a broad setup for any student that's responding to that. They get to decide what are some issues or concepts or ideas that are rubric-based and then reflected within their prescribed text that they can actually incorporate in their essays. This kind of question works quite well for a student who has pre-prepared different approaches and has tried to go in memorizing some of that key analysis, and more than likely with a broad question like that, it's going to be a lot easier for them to just get that down. And then the other term in here as well that's quite important in this example is the qualifier, the idea of complexity. Okay, and this is where, the nuance will come in. So when we think about complexity, it's also good to ask your students to consider some synonyms for these terms as well. So what are some other related terms or ideas to do with complexity? Is it significance, challenging? You could create a whole bank with them. I really recommend practicing on the board whole class of these. What are the type questions and what is being asked of you, because it is a process. A lot of students are not going to come to us naturally inclined to think critically and break things down in this way. So definitely do a handful of questions together as the teacher with your students, whole class sort of thing. If you can see your class is struggling, you might need to guide them a little bit. I know when I started teaching the HSC courses, I would definitely do this kind of stuff ahead of time, because I would think to myself, if a student's going to ask me, how do I go about answering the question, I need to have an appropriate response. And that was something that, I learned and I was taught and I was mentored in doing. And if you're an early scheme teacher, this does come more naturally to you. The more that you engage with different questions, the more that you mark and see different questions, you're definitely going to get a lot more guidance and it's going to come a bit more naturally. But in those early days, there is no harm in asking more experienced teachers, what are some ways that I might approach this question? Let them know I'm trying to break it down. What are some suggestions you might have? Because there's always, always, always someone I know that is more than willing to help and join in. And the reason it's so important to do this is when you are scaffolding your students to do this, you will note a time where you can pull back on those scaffolds. And then you should hopefully by the end of the year get to the point where they are going through this process on their own. And that's going to really set them up for success when they are doing examination conditions, where obviously there's nobody that they can ask to break down the question with. So it's a really, 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 really important skill, I think, in helping students to not only succeed in that response, but even just have the confidence of they know what they are doing. Okay, we might move on then to, we've broken down the question. How do we actually go about developing an approach? So there are a lot of different ways to do this. A lot of different teachers have their own strategies. I know I have seen multiple strategies and multiple examples, which is really, really beneficial because it really helps you to hone in what your strategy and your skill is. So this is one kind of way of doing it. When I break down a question with the class, I might then ask them, so what is a, guiding concept or kind of guiding issue or perspective that we can use in response to this question? And, this will become their eventual thesis. So something that I often suggest is, what is the purpose maybe of the text? So looking at that question, understanding your own prescribed text and what you've learnt about it, what do you think is a key purpose or perspective or message or values that are coming through with the text? So something simple we might ask students is, what is the text doing? What is the text conveying to us? What are we getting out of the text? What is its purpose and impact on the audience? And, for text and human experience, some students might say things like, with this particular text, let's say with Merchant and Venice, it's getting us to consider our social interactions with the other. It's, something else we might say is the text is getting us to look at how society might change in renewal of economic times, or looking at the ways that prejudice may impact how we act within and perceive the world. So obviously there will be lots and lots of different options depending on your own prescribed text. But I think that this is a good starting point, because that whatever statement they come up with here in terms of what is the text doing or saying or conveying to audiences, that's going to become the bones of a thesis. Now, students might already have an answer to this ahead of time that they've been playing around with. And so they might then use the opportunity of a practice question to see how they could adapt that perspective within the bounds of the question. So with a broad question like the example I gave earlier, you could pretty much put any of your, pre-prepared perspectives or thesis. You might need to do a little bit of adjustment, sure, but more or less it will work. The thinking has to come in when it's a much more specific and nuanced questions. You need to consider, is your thesis in line with that and nuanced enough, or do you have to produce a bit more nuance to it on the spot? Again, the more that students practice this, the easier that becomes, and that becomes a much more quicker, less daunting process as well. But we have to do the work ahead of time. We have to practice this as the process before we can kind of reap those rewards, right? So then once they've got that kind of guiding concepts, eventual thesis, then they would develop the thesis. You could even, if students are feeling not really confident right now writing the thesis specific to that question, you might just ask them, well, what is the point and power of this text, and get them to write the statement. And then with this question, because it's about complexity, so you might then ask them, and how is a complexity offered on this point or power of the text? And so that way you're breaking down the students and getting them to evolve kind of a partial thesis into a more question-specific thesis. It's important as well, like I always remind my students, these sentences right now, or the sentence we create now, it's not a summary of the text. In Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, so-and-so characters do so-and-so. That's not what we want. What we want is an argument, a point that you are very clearly making. The text is conveying this to audiences. The impact of it is in order to convey or portray. And so getting students to think in terms of argument and not summary should hopefully support them to create a thesis and get into the actual breakdown. So then once they've, actually I might just offer a little bit of an example. So an example thesis to that, practice question we noted earlier is, the text ultimately reveals that human experiences are shaped by conflicting desires for connection and control. So not only did we address the point of human experiences, but we conveyed the complexities part, because we've got this idea of conflicting desires. And we've also, as a student or, as part of analysis, we've added nuance, because we've decided that connection and control is a really important aspect of the particular prescribed text, and they are things that are often in conflict with each other, and that nuance is what really represents the difficulty in being human, or how hard it is to be a human, because we have these competing desires. So that's a really nice thesis statement, because it's answering the question in a way that's not just paying lip service. They've actually come to their own conclusion or determination of, this is the power of the text. This is the powerful way that it conveys complexity in showing us the concept, a notion of conflicting desire between connection and control. Then lastly, in terms of that planning and breakdown of the question, you've got your thesis for your approach. You need to actually then think about, well, how does that thesis or / approach break down into 3 separate ideas, 3 separate paragraphs? So here you might think about the fact that sometimes I say to my students, well, your body paragraphs are just your thesis broken down into, 3 sections. Sometimes that is a very neat separation in terms of ideas. Sometimes it's not. The important thing I think I say to students is to make sure that there feels like there is a flow or a build-up as those body paragraphs progress, that there is an importance in what becomes paragraph 1, what becomes paragraph 2, and what becomes paragraph 3. Because it will affect the flow. Teachers, markers, it affects the flow when there is this mismatch between ideas, or they're not leading chronologically or not leading approach-wise onto another. They're not building the thesis. As a teacher, you can tell. And as a teacher, the other thing that throws off your thesis is if your paragraphs are not separated and you're sort of saying a bit of the same thing across all 3. It's just not going to allow for clarity, and it's not going to give impact of argument. So it's really important to be able to separate in that way. Well, what am I doing in each body paragraph that ultimately, until I get to the end and my conclusion, they're going to build up and be able to answer that essay question. So based on that thesis, an example might be paragraph 1 might be all about that desire for connection. So you might be looking at which characters are doing that, because it's human experience. What qualities or emotions are engaged with here? Are there certain behaviors or motivators? What textual forms and features might be representing this desire for connection? Okay, then paragraph 2 might go on to, okay, now we've got the need for control. So looking at, and that's a nice flow from this idea of connection. We've got this connection, however, there's the control that would eventually be impacting it. So similar sort of thing. What behaviors, motivators, which characters, what qualities, what emotions, are there specific experiences of control occurring, and so students need to think about, how do I map that out too? So if I've got my connection, what's my experience relevant to connection? What are my textual features? What are any kind of sub issues or notions that might be at play? And then the third paragraph then might be, the consequences of this tension. So the consequences of the conflict between connection and control. And so that might be how the story kind of eventuates, how these things come to a head before they can kind of get resolved. So in these consequences of tension, you might be looking at the kind of latter quarter of your prescribed text. And that's a way that sometimes students find helpful as well, is in your first paragraph, you might be introducing things that are a bit more in the orientation or the setup of your text or the complication. Your middle paragraph might sort of feature the higher tensions, the climax, and your third paragraph might look at how we go towards the resolution. I mean, doesn't necessarily need to be separated like that. As teachers, we all know that there are multiple ways in, but I think it's a good and easy way to scaffold is, if you have a student that's really struggling, they might do their paragraphs in a very chronological order to kind of the driving plot line that then also enables them to talk about the human experiences, the complexities. If you've got students that are a little bit stronger, perhaps they're connecting rubric meta language into those ideas. So perhaps they're looking at anomalies, inconsistencies, and then separating them, depends what they prefer, or there might actually be sub ideas or actual qualities / values or experiences / issues, and they're actually creating 3 different ones to help explore that idea, just to create enough of that clarity and separation. The thing is, I always remember to tell my students that your paragraphs need to individually report back to the thesis and link back nicely. They also need to, as a whole, link back to the thesis. And if you're reading that and as a student and you're feeling that there's disconnection somewhere, then your thesis is not sustained. And if your thesis is not sustained, it's very hard to get into B+ and A territory, okay, based on the way that rubrics and marking criteria are set up. So that is a big thing that I say to my students too. Now, it is a lot what we're asking, I guess, of students to do on the spot. And students will say, how do I do this in, 10 minutes reading time and a 40-minute essay, and then I have to continue. Well, I say to them, this is the process. You don't do all this from scratch necessarily on the day, because you have practiced this strategy as you've gone along and you've gotten to the point where you've got multiple approaches with body ideas in your head. And on the day, depending on the question, you make a very quick and confident decision of what you're going to use, and perhaps incorporate any changes that you might need to hit the nuance of that question. But the more that you progress this along the way, it will evolve to the point where you've got a lot of pre-prepared approaches that you can then engage with on the day, and that will make the blind papers, a lot more easier. So last thing then, when we're breaking down essay questions, is obviously, putting it together now, making an introduction. And I know that some students prefer to do their body paragraphs first. I think that is okay if you're feeling really, really overwhelmed, and then you've got to go back to intro and then go back and check your body. But often when I have students that are feeling really stumped, there's no point in starting a body because that student doesn't know where it's going yet. And so often the introduction gives that student an opportunity to tease out what their approach might be. Because you will have students that, okay, they've got their kind of thesis and they've got their body ideas, but their brain hasn't quite yet put it together in like a little package to then be able to put it into sentences of an introduction. So the introduction is really handy because it's going to become that kind of almost summary of what you're about to produce. And if you're feeling not very confident, it's the perfect spot to start teasing that out and then get into the body with confidence. So as teachers, we would walk them through that process. We'd remind them of what an introduction does. As students, you would have been learning this since probably at least year 8, what an essay looks like, the features of an introduction. There is an onus here on you guys that you've got that as down pat kind of rote learned assumption of this is what an intro does. If you need a refresher, your teachers might give you one, but also remember you've got to be a bit prepared here to understand the base. Coming in with that understanding of the basics in the intro will make it much easier for you to then make all these connections. So then teachers might go over the intro again. Teachers might actually give you some, sentence starters or a bit of a scaffold for the actual introduction. So I know that some teachers like to give steps, 4 to 6 steps of the introduction, which could be representative of at least 4 to 6 sentences. Some teachers might actually give sentence starters or lead-in phrases for the parts of the introduction, particularly if you're working with a group or cohort that is struggling immensely. They might need those phrases to guide them to get the idea down. Some schools and teachers will just do parts of an introduction. So an example might be you need to have some sort of link to question. You might also be linking generally to the concept here. This is separate from the thesis. You might have a sentence or a section or a part of the introduction where you are introducing your prescribed text. You might also be including purpose, audience, and context here. Then you might be developing the ideas or starting to outline some of the issues that you're going to be doing and then wrapping up with that. And so therefore, this is my thesis. Now, I do mention to students, some students start first line with the thesis. Some prefer to build the introduction to their thesis. I think either is fine. I know I have a preference, but I don't it doesn't really influence my marking as long as the point being made in that introduction is still good and clear. So I think with this one, it's up to you. Some people like to just get it down straight away. I'm personally of the camp where I like to build that up with my ideas and then hit with the thesis, and the thesis being kind of the last thing the marker sort of sees before they get into the body. So generally, as long as you have all those aspects in there, in what order they are might not be the be-all, end-all, but it's important to know that these are the parts. If you've looked at any of our resources, teachers, you'd note that we've started using this kind of GST approach, which is more of a parts approach. So we'd have like a general section where we would look at some of the meta language or the concepts and bring in that more general conceptual understanding of the question. And then we would get into the specifics of the text in reference to the question and then the thesis. So, every school, every teacher has their way. Every student has their way. I know I've taught and tutored students who differ from what their school is doing because that's what works for them. And I am all for that, because I think with all of these scaffolds that we use, it's all related. It's all the same sort of thing. It's just the way that it's organized might be different. I'm a big fan of letting students work to their strengths as well. So I think that if they don't know what they're doing, they're going to use your scaffold, right? Whatever your school's writing platform is, or whatever it is you do in your class. If they don't know, you're taking that pressure off, and they should be very grateful because you're saying this is how you're going to do it. Then you might have some students who are doing a bit of a variation where they're taking on yours and then also putting their own spin on it, which is really cool. And then you would have students that might have looked at multiple examples across the years and multiple teachers and gone, this is the one that I think really works and allows my voice and perspective to come through. So this is what I'm going to use. And that's really powerful too. The thing that I always try to remind my students when they are doing those introductions is nothing should feel random in your introduction. There should be no phrase or sentence that just is kind of filler, because we don't have time for fillers in an essay, let alone in the introduction. The intro should, sentence by sentence flow from that original approach and thinking that you have already done in the planning, and now you're just recording that into longer, clearer, organized sentences into an organized introduction, small paragraph. And so, last thing that I might note for, new screen teachers and students as well is this is something that you would do throughout the terms. So, as a teacher or student, you might actually create a purpose, audience, and context sentence as you are doing this in those first few weeks that you're introduced to your prescribed text. And you might keep them in a summary document or, in your HSC notes somewhere, so that when the time comes, you're ready to pull those out, and then they become your baseline or your skeleton that you then develop further. We might actually try and come up with, so if we're a teacher, we might try and come up with purpose and perspective statements ahead of the learning. So maybe if we've taught this text a few times, we might have 3 to 5 that we have seen are very usable and adaptable, and we might introduce those at the start of the term to get students thinking. We might connect back to them a little bit just to get them to see how an approach aligns with analysis. It might actually, if you're a new scheme teacher, help to select some of these with your mentored, more experienced teachers, and that might actually guide the way that you perform analysis and guide your students to analyze throughout the term and in class. And as students as well, your teachers, what they say in their lessons is often gold. And so yes, you should be note-taking, and you might notice that they sometimes create these great statements that are very reflective of the point or the purpose or the impact of the text or a perspective or approach of the particular novel or issue. And so write those down and keep them on a separate page that you can always come back to. And then the other thing to do across the term that would help prepare you for the point where you are creating essay breakdowns is actually to highlight the big moments that are happening along your text. Selecting core issues or ideas that students can use to anchor their future body paragraphs. You might have a class that requires a lot of scaffolding, and therefore 3 to 5 issues or moments across the text is going to be plenty for them. We do have to consider the cohort or the group that we're teaching and what is perhaps overwhelmed, and also maybe what might be underwhelming. If you've got a group of very motivated, hardworking students, breaking it down in just 3 to 5 issues or ideas might be a bit limiting for them. And so you might consider what workshopping or strategies you might do to allow the students to have that, power and ownership over what they select from the text. And that always looks really nicely in terms of the actual voice that they're offering in their responses. Okay, and just last couple of points to make before I wrap up the solo episode. Any kind of final assurances we want to offer students, I often say to them, this isn't easy. It's not meant to be easy. It does get easier the more that we do it. It's the process. This is English. This is our bread and butter. I often say to them, your strong essays aren't written by namely just the smartest students. They are written by the students who are prepared. They are written by the students who know how to plan and who have the confidence to execute their ideas. All right. And so, because I think sometimes when you initially do this, I've had students go, this is too hard or this is too complicated. And everything's complicated the first few times you do it. Everything is. But naturally, the more we practice, the more we try, it becomes much more of an ingrained skill that we have that's going to serve the students immensely when they get into their assessment periods, into the trials, and then obviously the final HSC exam. And then one little kind of assurance or tidbit I often, remind students of is if they're feeling stuck in an essay, it's not because you can't write, it's not because you don't know, it's not because you're not a good essay writer. It's often because you haven't fully understood the question. Because if we have a very low surface level understanding of the question, naturally it's very hard for us to get into it deeply, which is what a critically analyze it and evaluate asks for us. So sometimes when the question is broad, we might think that's all there is to it. And I always encourage students, well, what synonyms or related ideas or meta language can connect and correlate with that question, which you can then use within your body paragraphs to support you in that deeper analysis and interpretation. And so, yeah, I just say to the students, this interpreting essay questions and breaking them down is a skill. Absolutely, it's a skill. It is a skill that takes time, but it is very achievable and very doable. And, when I have past students who will come back and chat to me or talk to, students who might be coming up on their HSC, they will say the same thing. It wasn't easy when I started. I wasn't great at it either, but I practice, and it paid off. And I'm happy with the results that I got, and I'm happy with the way that I engaged with it. So that's kind of like my final assurance there. And so I think then, to wrap up, teachers, if you're listening, you would have obviously your own approaches. Your school might have their own approach. I know that my approach is an amalgamation of a few different wonderful mentors that I have, and my approach still changes every year with each class. It changes even with the students that I tutor. It changes, and it has to change. It's got to evolve, and it's going to strengthen. These are some of the strategies that Adrielle and I find really useful and helpful when breaking essay questions down. And hopefully this more structured approach, if there's any students listening, will show you that this isn't something that comes natural at all. It's a very planned, premeditated kind of approach. And therefore, this is like the formula, okay? Where you're in any other subjects, this is the English formula. These are some things that you might do to really set you up with answering the specifics of a question, and therefore having a sustained thesis that is going to get you some really, really good results. Okay, so to wrap this up, I hope this has been helpful. I'm sorry I don't have the background with all our social media accounts. If you haven't noticed by now, Adrielle is usually the whiz with our podcast visuals. So if you are watching on YouTube, apologize. I did my best. I hope my best was good. You'll let me know. Work in progress over here. But as always, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you found something really helpful and useful from this episode, and we can't wait to have you guys listen to our next one. Please like and subscribe, engage with us. Let us know what you think. Let us know of your great approaches or strategies that have worked in your classroom. And for any students listening, know that there is a plan, there is a way. We just need to practice and engage with these. And thank you so much. Until next time, thanks for listening to another episode of Lit Happens.